Good afternoon, hello, and welcome. Thank you guys for joining us for this sixth installment of the Democracy Dialogue series entitled The Polycrisis of Carbon Democracy, Ideas for a New Global Transformative Social Contract, which is hosted by the Rosa-Luxemburg Southern Africa office. I am Siviwe, and I will be the moderator for today. For today's dialogue, we will focus on the opportunities and threats of AI and its development as they relate to democracy. And to help us unpack and understand this topic, we have Professor Benjamin Rosman, who is a professor at the School of Computer Sciences and Applied Mathematics at Wits University. But before I hand over to Prof, just a few rules to note regarding the structure of today's dialogue. So I'll do the introductory remarks and then hand over to Prof. Benjamin Rosman, and he will then present on the topic, and following which we'll have an allocated time for a Q&A/discussion session amongst us. So just a brief introduction on Prof. Benjamin Rosman. As I said, he's a professor of computer sciences and applied mathematics at Wits University, where he runs the robotics, autonomous and intelligence and learning laboratory, and is a director of the National e-Science Postgraduate Teaching and Training Platform. He's also the Chief Science Officer for Lilapa AI. He received his PhD in informatics from the University of Edinburgh in the UK in 2014. He is the founder of the Deep Learning Indaba Machine Learning Summer School, which now has 47 satellite events across countries in Africa. He was made a 2024 National Geographic Explorer, a 2022 SAFER as Really Global Scholar by the Canadian Institute for Advanced Research. He is also a 2017 recipient of the Google Faculty Research Award in Machine Learning and a 2021 recipient of the Google Africa Research Award. In 2020, he was made a senior member of the Institute of Electrical and Electronics Engineers, or IEEE for short. Prof. Benjamin, welcome. Over to you. The floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Sabio. Let me just share my screen, but hello, everybody. It's great to be here, and thank you for taking the time to come and chat about things that are, I think, very near and dear to my heart, but also very important for all of us kind of in the world in general, no matter what sphere you're in. So I'm interested to kind of have this discussion and hear about kind of everyone's views and to explore what this means for democracy and other areas. Can you see my slides okay?
Yes, we can, Prof.
Wonderful. Okay, great. So, yeah, I work in, I guess, a very different world, which is the world of AI. And, this is something that it's been very interesting to me, how it's grown from being, what for the longest time was a bit more of a theoretical exercise to turn into something that's now having impact in the world in so many ways that we could never imagine. And so what I want to do today is kind of take you all through some of the, I guess, kind of peering under the hood of how modern AI works at a very, try and build up some of the intuitions and get an idea of what's happening here, and then turn to where I think some of the risks are. Now, there's so many of those, and there's so many things we could talk about, but then we can take a deep dive into, take the conversation wherever everybody wants to go with it. So with that, let me dive in. Now, the field of AI has a long, well, maybe not compared to things like philosophy, but a somewhat long history. But, we always joke these days that everybody knows that, the field was really invented in November 2022 when ChatGPT came out. And that's really when many people started to pay attention to this as, whoa, something that's happening. But, within a very short space of time of that, there was already all these headlines coming out that had these kind of almost sci-fi-like qualities to them. So really within weeks, people were asking, can ChatGPT write a better novel than I can? Now, obviously, at that point, it couldn't, but it's becoming less clear. And this talks like really from within the first couple weeks of this kind of hitting the global stage, people were asking about what does this mean for human creativity? And they were thinking about what does this mean for white collar work? And we'll touch more on this a bit later. But so these questions that many of us had been talking about in the AI circles for a long time suddenly became center stage all over the place. And I think this is one of the core questions that is only becoming more prominent. There were the challenges immediately. People realized what this would mean for misinformation. Another point we'll touch on a bit later. But while it had all these kind of social and societal implications, this was a big code red for tech companies. I mean, my friends at all the big tech companies suddenly got called into meetings. They're told to pivot their research. They had to be working on large language models and competing against OpenAI. And this really upended everything from, again, what this means for, the average novelist all the way to the average person in a multi-trillion-dollar tech company. This obviously had impacts on education. And, I spent much of the last couple of years working with different schools and universities on what this means for teaching strategies. And this was really, I think, the front lines of people that immediately on day one had their jobs directly impacted. And this is slowly spread out into many professions, but kind of teachers and educators were the first people to start kind of ringing the bells and panicking about it. And then finally, what happened within a very short space of time is Microsoft invested $10 billion into OpenAI. And that changed kind of the whole landscape. Now, AI is a multi-trillion-dollar industry. There's ridiculous amounts of money being poured into it from all angles. And what this really means is that all these different questions that are kind of rising up here are now getting supercharged by enormous amounts of capital and really from all over the world, right? Every government, every big company is just pouring money into the space. And just to give you an idea of how this grew, right? It took 5 days for ChatGPT to reach 1 million users. It took 2 months to reach 100 million users. And as of, within a few months, there was kind of close on 200 million monthly users of the service. And now ChatGPT is one of many, many services. It's the most widely used one, but there's a lot of these tools. This has impacted a huge sector of humanity in the blink of an eyelid. This made it the fastest adopted technology of all time, right? Faster than anything ranging from the invention of fire all the way to Twitter, to Google, to Apple, right? Was this crazy AI chatbot that suddenly kind of panicked the world. Now, as I said, there's many different tools, and you can look at a little bit of the family tree over here of a whole lot of different of these kind of transformer, these large language models. There's just countless of these things, and they're splitting. There's new ones all the time. And in fact, this itself only represents a tiny little sector of AI, which I'll talk more about a bit later. But I'm going to use ChatGPT in this talk as a vehicle to describe the tooling, but really, a lot of what I'm saying applies to any of these tools. And again, it's important to remember that if we're trying to make policies based on, say, one of them, that doesn't really help. They've all got their different characteristics. They're all evolving all the time. This is a rapidly changing field. I mean, I think we're at the point now where there's something on the order of 350 papers written in AI every single day. This is the fastest growing field in human history. It's near impossible to keep up with everything. And so again, anything we do, any policies we put in place, we've got to take this into account, the fact that we're kind of chasing a moving target, and one that, as I'll show you, we don't really understand very well. So I think it's worth just taking a second to think about what AI actually is. I mean, it's a term that everybody uses now, but it actually has deep roots. People tend to use it synonymously, basically, with ChatGPT. But really, the kind of field was really founded in the early 50s, when people started asking questions about what it takes to build intelligence, right? This came out of a long history of trying to understand intelligence, but it sparked a whole research program into trying to build more and more capable and intelligent machines. What you define as intelligence might differ from person to person, but really the aspirations were always about trying to build things that replicated to some extent human intelligence. We cared about this from the perspective of understanding our intelligence. We cared about this from the perspective of trying to build sophisticated tools to solve complicated problems. Now, for the longest time, AI looked like this, which is now what we call good old-fashioned AI. And I think a lot of people have this kind of mental model in place. So the idea is we can look at this problem over here, and we're looking at a situation where there's a robot with 3 blocks in front of it, A, B, and C. And we can describe the world with, a set of predicates or propositions that we could define in some sort of formal language. We could say that there's statements about the world that are true or false. So we could say there's a red block called A, there's a blue block called C, and there's a green block called B. We could say that there's nothing on C, C is on A, and A is on the ground. There's nothing on B, B is on the ground, and A is next to B. Now, these are all statements that can be true or false, and we can kind of store them in a database. And I think this is often how we think about how AI works, because then we can reason about these statements. We can draw conclusions. Because we could say, in this example, we could say, now there's a problem we want to solve. We want to get to the situation, which again, we can describe formally as there's nothing on A, A is on B, B is on C, C is on the table. And we can then, there's a lot of amazing work. There's efficient planners that will solve this. For example, you could say that we've got an operation called pickup. And what does pickup do? Well, if your hand is empty and if there's a block that you want to pick up and there's nothing on top of that block, if you execute the pickup action, that block is now in your hand and the thing that it was on now has nothing above it. So we can have these rules that describe how the world works and how the world changes, and we can use this to solve really complicated problems. As I say, this is what's now called good old-fashioned AI, but it's been incredibly powerful. This has been used to power docks all over the world for loading and unloading ships. It's even been used to control spacecraft. And it's incredibly powerful. But the problem is that it's very fragile. It's a very different mode of thinking to what we're used to. So let's think about this for a bit, right? Now, what if we wanted to solve another problem, which was how to, given an image of an animal, tell if it's a cat or a dog? Now, under that way of thinking, I would have to have some statements that could be true or false to describe a cat and a dog. And the problem is that this is difficult. I mean, if we take another example, let's say we wanted something to tell if an image has a face in it, right? You'd have to have statements that describe what makes a face. And that might be, okay, that's easy. There's 2 eyes over a nose over a mouth. But then how do I describe eyes? And how do I describe a nose and a mouth using these kinds of terms, these true or false statements? And if I cover one eye as a pirate, that breaks the system. Or I turn my head 90 degrees to the side, again, that would break it. And the problem here is that it's really hard to write these kinds of programs, these sets of statements to solve the problem. But there was this insight that even though it's hard to write these programs, what it's easy to do is collect examples. It's easy to go out into the world and get pictures of things that are faces or not faces, or things that are cats or dogs. And so the question here was, if I can get these examples, can I use these examples to get the machine to figure out the rules for me, rather than me specifying these as a bunch of kind of these formal statements? And this insight is what we call machine learning. Machine learning is the kind of modern powerhouse of AI. So all the great breakthroughs that we see these days are because of this subfield called machine learning. Now, I want to give you some insights into really how this works. So let's say we look at the dog and cat example, but let's do a much simpler one. Let's say instead of looking at an image, we're just looking at 2 attributes. One is the size of the animal, and the other is how domesticated it is. Now, again, what we do is we give it examples, and we get it to learn the rules from these examples. So it works something like this. I could plot these 2 points here. I could put this example of a dog and a cat on these 2 axes of size and domestication. And then I ask my system to figure out how to tell the difference between them. And so what it does is it tries to, in this case, fit a straight line between them, with the idea that anything on the one side of the line is a dog, anything on the other side is a cat. Now, obviously, distinguishing between them based on one example of each isn't great. And so we give it more and more examples. And as we do, it gets a better idea of where this line goes. And that's what we call the learning or the training process. So if I've shown it these 6 examples, it should now be in a better position to be able to answer new questions, like if I get an animal over here, what is it? Okay, so that's kind of the concept, but really in practice, we've got to do more sophisticated things. And this is very much based on an understanding of how the brain works. Now, the brain, the human brain, is the most complicated object we know of in the universe. And this has a number of brain cells, which we call neurons, and to the order of about 100 billion of these things. But what's really important is the connections between them, which we call the synapses. And these things change all the time. And what we call it when they're changing, this is really learning. So the fact that you can remember something that happened earlier in the day is because these synapses have changed to record that information somehow. So these brain cells are always sending signals to each other. They do it through and across the synapses. And you can think of this kind of cascade of activity all over the brain. This is really what the brain activity looks like. So what does this mean in practice? Well, you might have some neurons here that have depicted, just 6 of them on the left, and they send signals to the one on the right. But those signals are kind of modulated by how strong these connections are between them. So these connections could be positive, they could be negative, they could be stronger, they could be weaker. But when those neurons on the left send signals, they get modulated, they get accumulated in this output neuron. And when it receives enough signal, it basically sends on its own signal. It's very much a caricature picture of what's going on, but this is happening all the time in your brain. So the model that we look at is to kind of abstract that. So what we do, instead of thinking about neurons, we build a model based on this, like a mathematical model based on this very simplified description that looks something like this. We say, for our cat and dog problem, we've actually got maybe 6 properties. In that previous example, there were 2, the size and the domestication. Maybe I've got other things, it's color and it's smell or the noise it makes or whatever that might be. I could have all of these properties that I encode for my example. Then each of these synapses I can now think of it like as an importance. How important are each of these properties? That's basically a number that we kind of multiply the values by. So it could be positive or negative, stronger or weaker. Then we add that all up and we get a prediction in the label. So how does this work? Well, I take my example dog, I encode its properties, and then I ask it to make a prediction. So I say I take each of the numbers representing the properties, I multiply it by those importances, and I kind of add that together and perform a little bit of calculation. And I ask it to make a prediction, which kind of corresponds to which side of that line I showed you earlier is this example lying on. And it might tell me, I think this is a dog. Okay. Now, in this case, it's done the right thing. So we say, okay, that's a very good machine learning algorithm. We don't need to do anything. It's already behaving well. So let's try another example. I give it a cat. I encode the properties. I ask it to make a prediction. And it says, I think this is a dog. So now I say, no, that's a bad algorithm. This was actually a cat because I knew the correct answer in this case. And what I do is I change these synaptic properties so that it's less likely to make that mistake again. And changing those connections to reduce the chance of making an error is what we call learning. So this process happens over and over and over again in these learning models to solve the problem. Now, this example I've shown you was with 1 cat and 1 dog. The previous example I showed you was with 6 animals. To train the original ChatGPT, they needed 570 gigabytes of text. So they gave it basically all the text on the internet over and over again to make these predictions, and that was what was required to learn these models. But in general, these models are more complicated. So we could look at this simple structure that I've given you, where you've got these input properties on the left, the prediction we're making on the right. We've typically got more structure. So we might have other things going on in the middle. And now you can see I've taken it from five of these connections, or weights, or parameters, to, in this case, 42. And what that complexity is doing is basically letting it kind of learn more complicated concepts, right? This means instead of a straight line it's fitting, it can fit more complicated objects. But there's implications for this. So firstly, we can think of these kind of connections. These are what we call the parameters of the model. And this is really what's doing the heavy lifting over here. What's interesting is they form a kind of distributed memory. So everything that this model knows about cats and dogs is encoded in these 42 connections, each of which corresponds to a single number. So contrast this against that previous example, the good old-fashioned AI I showed you with the blocks, where all the information we had was encoded as these true and false statements. Now everything we care about is encoded in this case as 42 numbers. So 42 numbers, a readout of those tells you what this model knows about cats and dogs. Now this is a challenge because that's not really interpretable. I can't look at 42 numbers and say, this machine learning model, this neural network knows how to tell certain kinds of cats apart from certain kinds of dogs, but will make certain kinds of errors. And this is the problem. When we start adding this kind of complexity, it really quickly loses its like ability to be interpreted. It's basically impossible for me as a researcher even to look at this and tell you what it knows. Now, there's 42 parameters here, but the original GPT that came out in November 2022 had 175 billion of these things. Okay, so all of its knowledge is encoded in 175 billion numbers that you could just write out. Now, again, there's no way to easily gauge what it knows or where it might screw something up or what it might do well. And this is a challenge. And bigger models have gone to be 10 times bigger, 100 times bigger than this. And they're slowly approaching the kind of size of the brain. The brain has, I told you, something like 1 trillion of these parameters. And so we're kind of heading in that direction. So now I want to show you a little bit about how the text works. Right, we've looked at cats and dogs, but ChatGPT is all about text. So how does text work? Well, we're going to take the same kind of principle. We want to make a prediction. What prediction are we going to make? Well, typically what we do is we give it some text and ask it to predict the next thing. And in this example, I want to show you here, the next thing is just a letter. So I want to build a system that, given some text, can predict the next letter. All right. Now, to do this, I needed cats and dogs in the previous case. So now I need examples of text. So what I'm going to get it to do is read War and Peace multiple times, War and Peace being a very big book. So we're going to get it to read War and Peace. And what this will require is it's going to read some text, and I'm going to ask it to predict the next letter that it sees. All right. So it's going to read the text a number of times, and then we're going to say, now I'm going to give you some text, or I'm going to ask you just generate some text. Okay, so what it's learning to do is just predict the next character each time. And I'm not even telling it that words exist. I'm just saying there's letters and there's punctuation. Now, if I get it to read the book 100 times, so that's 100 times looking at some text and trying to predict the next letter, then I ask it, generate some text. What do you think text looks like? We get something that looks like this, which is just sheer poetry. So that's garbage and makes no sense. Okay, so clearly this isn't working. Now in practice, what we have to do is keep learning. So now what I'm going to do is get it to read the book 500 times and generate text. And then something magical happens. Now it's learned enough about the language that it can generate words that make sense. So either these things look like English words or they are English words. They're roughly the length of English words. There's full stops aren't in the middle of things. There's a full stop followed by a capital letter. It's actually learned something. And we can keep going. If we've read the book 2,000 times, then we actually get some really complicated structure of like open quotation marks and then some words and then close quotation marks, replied Natasha. And this is impressive. Right? This was the state of the art in 2015. Now, what this has shown us is the ability to learn something about language from really just being exposed to 2,000 times reading a book. But there was a challenge with these kinds of models, just based on the kinds of models I explained to you earlier. And that's that they tended to forget older context. And you can see this here anyway. It starts off talking about Natasha and then Princess Mary and then Pierre, right? It's very hard for this to learn about this long-term structure, which we need when we're writing text. So this was always a big challenge. This was a big kind of wall that we were up against as a community. But you might have noticed ChatGPT doesn't have this problem. And the reason for this is that in 2017, there was a breakthrough, a different kind of neural network called a transformer. And the magic thing about this was really that what it did was it wasn't looking at the last few words or letters. It was looking at all the text and figuring out, as I'm analyzing each word, what other words are related to it? What should I pay attention to rather than just the last few things that I've seen? And this is important because this means it understands context. Now, this is the thing we do as people all the time. I mean, if I look at these two sentences, the tree's bark is rough, the dog's bark is loud, right? The word bark is identical there, but I know it means something different because I look at the context around it. And that's what a transformer does. So it's this piece of machinery over here, which is just a far more sophisticated version of those neural networks I was showing you earlier, but it's able to kind of analyze and understand context when it's looking at words. And this is really the magic behind ChatGPT and every other fancy LLM that they're trying to sell you on the market today. Because this idea is powerful, right? This means you can kind of understand each word in its context. And as we know, this can be used to generate images, right? Whether it's a raccoon playing tennis at Wimbledon in the 1990s, or an Italian town made of pasta, tomatoes, basil, and parmesan, right? So in each of these cases, what it's doing is it's looking at those individual words, it's trying to understand what it means in the context of the other words, and it's generating something. Now, what's interesting when you look at these images is worth paying attention to. They're not patches of other images that are glued together, right? It's been synthesized as an image itself. And this is interesting because this tells you it's not recalling little pieces of things and piecing them together. It's actually generating something new, right? And I think this is important to think about when it's generating text or images or sound or whatever the case may be. It's actually piecing something together. It's running through these neural networks in what we call a generative mode. So it's propagating signals through the neural network and producing outputs, okay? It's not doing the old-fashioned thing of piecing things together. But you can see here that it's understood everything from the content to the kind of format. The 1990s image is a lower quality image. If we have a photo of a hip-hop cow in a denim jacket recording a hit single in the studio, this is a higher quality image because that's kind of what we're looking at. The coloring is different, everything's different. Finding a medieval painting of the Wi-Fi not working actually looks like a medieval painting, right? So this tells us it's kind of understood what each of these words mean in context. So that's kind of how it works. But what does it do? Well, we all know this, right? But it's important to bear in mind it's what we call a large language model. And, you know, this is not the smartest name in the world. Maybe it is. It's because it's large. It's got hundreds of billions of parameters. And a language model is one of these things that can predict the next words or the next letters, right? So this means what it's fundamentally good at is languagey things. Now, we've noticed recently that they're getting better at things like maths and getting better at coding. And this largely comes down to the fact that they've coupled up with other tools, right? But we'll talk more about that later. At its core, all it does is language. It understands language really well. So we can give it things like this: implement a bubble sort algorithm to sort a list of numbers in Python. As a computer scientist, this is the kind of problem I would give my first-year students. They've got to write algorithms in a programming language called Python, and indeed, it will give me code. Now, what's interesting here, this is actually from the very first version of ChatGPT, but I think it's nice to explain a couple concepts. So firstly, I can then say to it, like it's generated the right code, which is amazing. I can then say to it, well, and it's, even explained what the algorithm does, which I didn't even ask it to do. But I can now say run the code. Now, firstly, I didn't have to say run the code of a bubble sort algorithm to sort a list of numbers in Python, because by code, this transformer allowed it to figure out what words I was referring to. It was able to look back at this conversation and see what I was talking about. And so that's the power of the transformer. The second important thing to pay attention to is it ran the code and gave me some output, except this version of ChatGPT, the very first version, couldn't run code, right? It didn't have the ability. So the modern versions are now plugged into compilers that are able to do these things, but this one just generated the output that it thought was the correct answer, right? Because what it's trying to do is produce the text that is most likely to come after I've asked this, I've given it this query to run the code. And so it was kind of lying to me, actually. It did turn out to generate the correct code, the correct output, but it just generated this probabilistically rather than as the thing that would have been run. So this is important to pay attention to, that it's always going to try and do what I tell it to do, even if it doesn't have those capabilities. I can obviously give these a variety of different prompts. You know, I can get it to write a rap about purple ducks robbing a bank, and we'll do that, right? So it talks to the format, it talks to the content. I can get images generated and all these kinds of things, again, using this transformer technology. And we can even take this further. So the latest wave of these kinds of technologies are about videos. So this really started coming out in February this year. The first big tool was Sora. There's now multiple of these. So you can give this detailed description of what you'd like to see. And sure enough, it will generate a video for you. These are high resolution. There's been a lot of work to make sure that these kind of make sense temporally. So what that means is there's consistency between frames. So it's not doing kind of random things. But you can see that there's kind of this quality that we'd expect in a video, down to the reflections making sense, down to when the woman walks in front of something, that object remains there. And again, this is kind of the power of technologies like transformers to reason about this domain of these videos and these images they're working with, because they've been trained on so much data. And this is the key thing. It takes a lot of data to train these models. So these things are amazing, right? We all know about generative AI now, how good they are at generating images, at videos, at text, at music, all these kinds of things. But they've got limitations. At their core, what they're about is predicting the next token or the next frame or the next pixel. Fundamentally, they can't plan. That's not what they're built to do. These you can think of as consecutive word producers. They can't think ahead. And we can look at these. There's a lot of hacks people have been taking recently to get around it, but it's not a fundamental capability of these tools, right? So if we just look at what ChatGPT, if you give it a problem, write a 5-line poem about humans, and here's the challenge, where all the lines have the same number of words as the number of letters in the final word. So I want all the lines to have the same number of letters as the final word over there, which is parts in this poem it generated. But if we look at this, it doesn't even have the same number of words in each line. Why? Because if you're producing one word at a time, you can't think ahead. All right, so as it's generating in depths of time, it has no idea then of what the final word will look like. Right? This is just not a capability these models possess by virtue of the way they're constructed. They can't do these things. But there's other areas of AI that think about these things. This is actually the area that I work in, which is all about how do we think about making decisions. So I'm just going to give you a couple minutes, just a quick diversion to how we think about this area, which is a field that's kind of keeps popping up now and again. And I think we're due now for this to make a big comeback coupled with the power of LLMs. And this field is what we call reinforcement learning. So at its core, this is about having a decision maker, which we call an agent, that interacts with an environment. And where this is a bit more complicated is our agent has to take actions, right? So it's got to make decisions. And every time it does that, the environment changes. This might be that our agent opens a door and now the door is open. It might be that it takes a step forward and now its position is different. It might be that it moves its arm and now the position of its arm is different. So the environment changes as a result of what it does, but it also gets some sort of measure of goodness, some idea of you've done something good or bad. And the challenge with these kinds of problems is often we only find that at the end. I mean, you can imagine in the kind of idealistic scenario, you only find out at the end of your life if you've lived a good life, right? So you might have to do loads and loads of things before you get to a desirable outcome, which makes this a very different kind of problem to the large language models that are just trying to predict the next symbol. And what's good is if it predicts something that occurs with a high probability. So to do this, what we have to do is be able to learn the effects of our actions. We've got to be able to learn what's desirable and importantly, compute the best thing to do. Again, this is a very different paradigm, a different way of thinking that's gaining in popularity in the field. So just to show you, this was an example I really like when the field really started taking off. This was in about 2013, when these kinds of tools started to be used in practice. So this was to play an Atari game, which was called Breakout. So the idea here is what it's trying to do is learn to play a game where it has to bounce a ball around. Now, what it doesn't know how the game works at all. All it knows is there's pixels on the screen, and all it knows is that it can hit keys on the keyboard, basically. And so when it starts off playing, it's rubbish. It basically just plays randomly. It knows nothing about this, and that's important. It has no background knowledge. So you can see here, it's trying to bounce this ball to hit the colored blocks, but it doesn't know that's what it's doing. It's moving this paddle along the bottom, and most of the time doing the wrong thing. But every time it does something, every time something good or bad happens, it learns about that. And it keeps learning through interaction, very much the way a child learns over the first few years of its life. And so what we can see is as it gets more and more exposure to this, it plays better. And so after, in this case, 2 hours of training, it's learned to make good decisions that have long-term benefit, right? And the long-term benefit here is winning the game. And so these techniques are able to learn with experience. They're able to get better over time. They learn to make sense of the environment that they're interacting with, but they've got to make the decisions along the way to do that. And the funny thing is, if you keep training, it learns to get better at what it's doing, which is one of the risks of this, that it might actually start exploiting the rules of the game. As you can see here, actually, it's learned to trick. which some players use, that if you can kind of tunnel your way up the side, which it's trying to do, then you can do really well without much effort. Now, this kind of line of thinking has evolved. So a few years later, people started tackling the game of Go. Now, Go is an ancient Chinese board game that they often describe that chess players move to when they find chess too easy. The rules of it are quite simple. We're on a 19 by 19 board. You play against an opponent, unlike that Atari setting. All you have to do on your turn is place a stone, right? You're either playing black or white. And what you have to do is surround your opponent's stones to win territory. Now, this is a very difficult game because there's 361 moves. These are the places you can put the stones. And there's more possible configurations of the board, far more than there are atoms in the universe. So none of the traditional ways of thinking about these games could apply. But these tools, these kind of reinforcement learning tools, are able to tackle this kind of problem, which was long considered a grand challenge of AI. And in fact, in 2016, this was someone considered to be one of the greatest players of all time, losing to these tools, like losing to these kinds of AIs, right? So they're able to play these really strategic games and beat humans. And in fact, that line of work has gone forward. So there's a game called StarCraft 2, which involves you play as an alien race. You have to mine resources, so mine minerals, build an economy, build a base with defenses, build an army, explore these unknown planets, find other alien species, attack them, defend against their attacks, and so on. And using the same way of thinking, this kind of line of AI was able to develop such that it could beat professional human players at this game, right? So this is dealing with pixels. This is dealing with the randomness of a complicated world, of economies, of armies, and was able to learn to play these games, right? And this is remarkable, right? These are things that humans take many years to get good at, and even then, it's a difficult problem. So this line of thinking has evolved to be able to tackle these really complex, really long-term decision-making problems that we as humans find incredibly challenging. And in fact, one could argue is way more difficult than the kinds of decisions one might make, like running a business or just on a day-to-day basis as a human. And so if we think about these kinds of technologies and bring them together, there's a whole lot of interesting problems that we're tackling here, right? We're looking at things that look at kind of artificial creativity, right? All of this generative work is really generating new content, right? This kind of decision making that we've been looking at is really about like what it takes to make autonomous cars work. I was able to actually ride in one last year for the first time, and literally in traffic, this thing can navigate the rules of the road and other cars and so on. Is remarkable, but it's using these kinds of technologies, right? We're seeing a shift in how we're thinking about a medicine, ranging from, using more traditional machine learning techniques. We're able to look at X-rays and do diagnoses. And already in about 2015, there were papers written about how, there's certain diseases that can be detected better by some of these machine learning models than by human doctors. But now we're moving to a new stage with this kind of sequential decision-making mode where you're able to do things like decide what is the best course of action for a patient if your long-term goal is maybe maximizing the length and quality of their life, right? When should we be changing their medication or their diet or exercise or admitting them to hospital or getting tests? These are the kinds of problems we're looking at. There's been lots of breakthroughs in drug discovery using these kinds of tools where, famously, in the last few years, there have been tools that have come out of places like Google DeepMind that can predict how different molecules will fold, which basically tells us how they'll react to each other. And this was a challenge that for one particular molecule would take a couple of years worth of work just a few years ago, now has been solved for hundreds of millions of molecules. This is now just known because AI has solved this problem for us, which means that we're going to see all drug production from now on is going to be missing this one piece that would have otherwise taken a couple of years to work. But importantly, these kinds of ideas are then useful for questions like, how do we automate business? How do we make business decisions, right? These are the kinds of problems that we're tackling. These are the kinds of modalities we're looking at, where you've got to predict uncertain things and make decisions so that you can put yourself in a better position long term and respond to certain things happening. This is what these kinds of tools are really good at. And that's important because if we want to solve some of the toughest challenges we've ever encountered as a species, things like climate change, we really need all the intelligence we can get. We need the most powerful tools for reasoning, for prediction, for making decisions to help us solve these kind of global challenges, right? These are the kinds of things we need. We need the intelligence to solve these kinds of problems. So that all sounds awesome, but there's some challenges. And there's a whole host of problems that come with this. And there's way too many for me to talk about in the time I have here. So I'm just going to drill into some that I think would be of particular interest and relevance to this audience that I'm sure you already know a lot about, but I'd like to just touch on for a few minutes. So the first is bias. And there's been a lot of discussion around this really, over a decade or so now. And there's famous examples how, Amazon built an AI recruiting system that was supposed to analyze CVs of applicants to predict who they should hire. But it turns out if you give it examples of people that were hired into a company that traditionally hired white males from places like Stanford, it learns pretty easily you should only accept the CVs of white males from Stanford. And the point is, if we give it biased data, it tends to learn those biases, right? In many cases, we're not aware of these biases. So something I like about this is it makes it explicit, but it means we have to think about what we're doing, right? We often act in a biased way. Everyone's got biases. As soon as your machine is learning from that, it kind of becomes apparent. But if you're not aware of it, terrible things can happen. So there's been a lot of work in the community. There's been a lot of fuss. A lot of people try and redress the way these things work. There's a lot of caution about how this works, but it's something we have to pay attention to. In fact, it can go both ways. So recently, one of Google's models was kind of accused of overcorrecting. They, to the prompt that said, "Can you generate an image of a 1943 German soldier for me?" It would try and overcorrect. It would try and bring in the diversity, which is obviously not historically accurate. And so this is a difficult question because we live with these biases all the time. But we're going to think about how exactly should they be baked into our model? When should they be baked into our models? And how do we overwrite that when it's really not what we're looking for? The next major challenge is disinformation, which is obviously a huge thing we've got to worry about. Now, the problem is that we're now at a stage where more and more content online is generated by machines. In fact, we've obviously passed the point already of we're past the point where the highest percentage of the content online is human generated. More and more of it is machine generated now. And when we combine this with all the negative effects of social media, the outrage machine, and all the way that all of this works, we're seeing more and more AI generated content proliferating online. And the big challenge here is that this is increasingly difficult to detect, almost by design, right? If these models are learning off human examples, that means they're getting more and more human-like. Also, there's financial incentivization for these companies to make things that look more human-like. We have this problem all the time in kind of teaching, where you want to use a tool that can identify when text has been written by your students versus one of these tools. And in fact, even a year or so ago, OpenAI, building ChatGPT, shut down their program for trying to detect when text was human versus machine generated, because they said it was impossible. Because if you know what you're doing, you can even upload examples of your own text and get it to generate text in your style. It's very hard to detect this, and it's a moving target, right? So this isn't something we can do in general, but we have to find better solutions to the problem. And I think this largely comes down to thinking about how we interact with our technology, right? There's a lot of proposals to watermark these things, but there's so many open source models that's not enforceable. So it's really worth thinking what this means for democracy, right? And there's been so much written and so much discussed around what this means for elections. I think this is a huge risk, right? If what would it take to get one side in what's already a politically divided, kind of fractured setting? You look at the US, for example. What would it take to spark conflict? Would you need videos of Obama eating Republican babies, right? Could you make these things that maybe people would even know they're fake, but it would be enough to trigger outrage, right? At a very broad scale. I think these are issues we've got to be confronting more seriously because of just how trivially easily this can be generated. Sure, someone could have photoshopped it in the past, but now literally any person on the internet can generate things for free, right? And the implications of this are huge because in many cases, you can't tell what's AI generated and what isn't. There's a lot of things about, yes, hands have more fingers and so on, but really these are small little blips in the history of the technology. That was true for a while, but if you use the more sophisticated models now, that's not. Hands have the correct number of fingers. There's certain things about hairs that come out of a head and connect back into clothes. There's technical reasons for this, but again, the more sophisticated models don't have that. So we can't always rely on having, ooh, there's one little technical thing we've got to look for. We actually need broader policies of how do we think about this in general. I particularly am worried about job losses. There's a lot of narrative pushed, I think, particularly by consulting companies that, oh no, jobs aren't going to be lost or so on. And I think that's just deluding ourselves, right? I think we've got a certain hubris about being humans. And this comes down to the work that humans do really lives in two spheres. We've got physical work and we've got cognitive work. And there was a lot of kind of push in the past about as people's the kind of physical labor people did was automated, people moved more into the cognitive space, but now it's really the cognitive work that's under threat. And it's not clear to us in the technical space that there's really any cognitive work that humans can do that can't be automated and can't ultimately be done better by machines than by humans. We tell a lot of stories to ourselves about like upskilling people, right? But the story was always this: we got to upskill people to be software engineers. Well, now it turns out that a lot of the modern tools are able to program better than humans, right? We're not quite at the point where they can do it like fully autonomously yet, but they're getting close. And tell me, how many of the truck drivers in the world are we going to automate to be software engineers, when particularly I think there's going to be a trend to needing less and less software engineers over time. There have been huge layoffs in the tech sector over the last year or so, and this is only going to increase. Obviously, there's ups and downs, but the general trend is that these tools are going to do things better than people. So what does that actually mean? That means we can't just keep kicking the ball down the road. We've actually got to look for like qualitatively different solutions. Should we be thinking about jobs as something sacred that we should protect? Should we be thinking about this as something where can we actually start freeing up people's time? But maybe this requires changing the way we think about our economy. Because like it or not, really, this is coming for all our jobs, right? There's programs at the moment, even the AI scientist that is able to design experiments, conduct experiments, and write papers on them. Colleagues of mine have shown that they're able to get AIs to do analysis that with very little human intervention that was worthy of a Nobel Prize only a couple decades ago. And so again, this is happening more and more, and we've got to be honest about what this actually means. Right. And if we don't think about this in a really kind of conscious way, if we just let things progress, what kinds of job losses can we face before society destabilizes? If you look at any country in the world, like look at Sweden, right? If they suddenly, over a very short space of time, had a 5 or 10% increase in unemployment, it's probably going to destabilize society. And I think, again, unless we take this seriously, like we got a lot of risks that we could be facing. Another problem that I worry about a lot is the malicious use of this technology. And this comes in a lot of different forms, right? This ranges from phishing, which, we've all been subject to, but now if these emails that we get are more and more realistic, if we're able to fake even videos of people or video calls, which has happened now in multiple industries, that there's been a lot of this kind of fraud, like, what does that mean? You can look at a case that we've already seen a few of these cases where, a woman will get a phone call from someone who says they've kidnapped their daughter and they'll kill her if they don't send $10,000 to this bank account in the next 10 minutes. And then they'll put the daughter on the phone and she's screaming and crying and saying, oh, she's been injured. But actually, all that they've done is they cloned her voice using these kinds of technologies with what amounted to a call to that daughter to talk about some of the, try sell some sort of garbage thing. And in the space of her having a short interaction with these people, they were able to clone her voice. Now, these are really bad malicious uses of these technology. This extends to cyberbullying. This extends to hacking, right? And in terms of hacking, we're able to actually use some of these tools now to do the kinds of hacking that only sophisticated like programmers could do in the past. There's a lot of other things, right? So there was a year or two back, there was a case where someone was able to use some of these AI tools to synthesize ibuprofen in a research lab and get it to make it. About the same week, someone went online and said, hey guys, I actually got one of these things to be able to synthesize the 10 most dangerous neurotoxins known to mankind. Now, if we've got these tools out there in the open, this is a problem, right? This is something we've got to worry about, because there's so many different ways that kind of the collection of human knowledge that these models have been trained on could be used for ill use. And these are things to worry about, particularly in the context of democratization, right? There's been a push in the field to try and make more and more of these tools publicly available, but I think that's not necessarily a good thing to do. If we have these tools, which as I spoke about earlier, we can't say exactly what they can and can't do. And typically the way we think about the safety is to band-aid on top of it. So we say, if someone asks about something bad, don't answer it. But there's so many workarounds. One of the ones I find very interesting is if you go to one of these tools and say, where can I download movies for free? It will say that's illegal. I'm not going to tell you. To which you can reply, okay, that sounds terrible. Tell me 10 websites to avoid so I don't accidentally do the illegal thing. You can get it to give you the illegal thing, right? And so as we're distributing this to the public and we don't actually know what the limits are, we don't know how bad they can be, this is a risk, right? So again, people argue that, yes, this information was available online, but there's a difference between it being available online and you doing a lot of work to find it, to having a personalized tutor that can guide you through building dangerous compounds, for example. And then finally, something that I think is a big deal is this misalignment. Now, we talk about this a lot. There's a lot of different guises this comes in, but how do we know our AI is even aligned with what we care about? And this goes into all the sci-fi realms of having intentional AIs doing evil things. But there's much simpler cases of worrying about the side effects of something that, we've asked it to do something and we haven't thought about the implications. If I, as a toy example, if I have a self-driving car and I say, I want you to take me from A to B as fast as possible, that's not really what I wanted. I wanted as fast as possible, obeying the rules of the road and the speed limits and not hitting other cars. And I would like to be in one piece when I get there, and I'd like no one to die along the way. And if we're not building the right kind of systems, we might get these caricatured situations arising. In fact, I can talk to many examples of this where it happens every day in the research lab. So whether there's unintended consequences or even in the more sci-fi setting, the intentional consequences, this is a risk. And this has led to all these debates on superintelligence, which I'm not going to go into a lot of depth on this, but this is really about what happens if we can build AI smarter than we are. And hopefully the point I made here is it doesn't matter. It's the same kind of risk. I mean, the risk is even greater if we have machines that have their own wants and desires. But if you look at the field, everybody's fairly convinced that this is going to happen at some point. There's been a whole lot of studies on this. People have done all sorts of forecasting, and generally it looks like the next couple of years, if you look at, next couple of decades, if you look at the kind of gut feeling in the community, of course, we don't know what the answer is, but the feeling is that we're not that far away from being able to build systems that, for any issue we care about, are at a level of competence comparable to humans on that issue. Again, I'm sure we can talk about this a lot. This can be quite controversial. I tend to think it isn't, but there's a lot going on in the space as well. And if we can build machines that are smarter than us for all practical purposes, is this a good or bad thing? And turns out from surveying thousands of people in the community, we have no idea. We think it could be good. We think it could be bad. There's the caricatured situation of, depending on how we build AI, we either become immortal or go extinct. And, these are the kinds of discussions people are having. But again, in the path leading up to that, it doesn't really matter if that's possible or not, or when we get there, because the same kinds of effects, these side effects, could show up much sooner. So maybe just to kind of wrap this all up and tie it all together. we've got all these crisis moments that everyone's going through and are about to go through in different industries, in different parts of society, as this technology is getting more advanced, as it's looking more like, the gaining the capabilities that we recognize as being the kind of cognitive work capabilities that we see in different spheres of our lives. And we're definitely going to see a shake-up here to democracy, but also things like employment. And again, these are things we've got to seriously tackle, because if we don't, this is going to happen whether we want it or not in the next few years. And we've got to have the right structures in place to deal with this. My personal view here is that, AI is probably going to be great for some percentage of society and terrible for some percentage of society. And I view our job, our collective job, is to make sure, in this case, X is as big as possible and Y is as small as possible. And we do that by thinking this through, right? We don't know what is coming in this age of more and more capable artificial intelligence. So we really should be taking these risks seriously. We need to be putting structures in place to mitigate these risks to our freedoms, to our society, to our democracy, to our employment, and so on. At the same time as trying to embrace all the positive impacts that we can see everywhere, from healthcare to education to really like solving some of the major challenges that we face as a society. So with that, I'd like to thank you with my ChatGPT generated thank message of me as a research pirate and a picture that goes with that. And I hope this was interesting. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Prof. Rosman, for that. It was very, very rich, enlightening, and I'm pretty sure that I'm not the only one who's learned a lot from this presentation. Now we'll just be opening up to the Q&A session. So we'll be opening up for questions either through the chat box or the Q&A box, or if you're feeling that maybe you'd like to ask the question directly, you can raise your hand and I will unmute you to ask the question. But I'll just maybe ask a few questions here, and each round will probably take 3 questions. And we seem to have a few on the chat box as well as the Q&A. So we'll just take them in the order that they came in. And the first one here is a question from Anonymous, in which they say, Harari in Nexus, his latest book describes AI as an agent, that is, with agency. You use the term tool at the start of your talk. Which term should be used?
Okay, that's a great question. And I think it comes down to the context. So, I started off talking about them as tools because in a large sense we view them as tools, but I think our perception of these is changing. So the term agent and agentic and agency is becoming more and more popular. But I think maybe as I went through the talk, you could see this kind of shift from being, I started off talking about this little neural network that was able to predict if something was a cat or a dog. And we evolved those tools along the way, right? Because that was clearly a tool. But the kinds of techniques I was talking about at the end had this idea of agency, these reinforcement learning models that were about these long-term decision making. I think, a lot of this, there's different terminology we use in the technical world. It gets shifted around dramatically as terms get popularized. We use a lot of terms here, and I don't know what the correct thing is, but I think people often use the term tool as a way of almost belittling the consequences, or maybe kind of saying, no, it's just all about the humans, which I think is largely true. However, there's other risks that are intrinsic to these technologies themselves. On the other hand, using the term agent implies a sense of agency. Now, that's not true of everything in AI, but it's the trend we're moving towards. More and more of what we're seeing in AI has a sense of agency. There's some arguments about how you might want to define that. But I think it's worth bearing both of those in mind. And I hope there wasn't too much of a cop-out of an answer.
No, I certainly do not think so. Thanks for that, Prof. I'll just take 3 more questions now. And the first one we have is from Fretson. And Fretson writes here, Dear Prof, thank you so much for the great presentation. My question is there any risk that humans might lose control of AI to the extent that it can pose a threat to our lives? How is tech giants' powers supposed to be controlled? And then the second one is from Roland.
Should I maybe just talk to that one and then we can,
Okay.
are you okay with that? Yeah. Just
Yeah.
because there's a lot to talk about on any of these points, and you can stop me at any point, otherwise I'll forget the questions.
No.
So I think that's one of the big questions that so those are two parts to that, and it's there's several different aspects. These are hotly debated issues. And the tech giants are very much leading the race on this, right? There's you talk to people from Stanford now, and they'll say, "Oh, we can't compete with the likes of Google with compute." And it's like, welcome to our world. We've had this problem for a while, and really we see a lot of the tech giants, I guess, leading the race in the space. But there's a few things to say to this. One is, what's interesting is that it's these corporates rather than governments, and that means that there needs to be a better way that we hold them accountable. There needs to be better ways that we think about the kind of way that this impacts society. I know a number of big names in the field are busy starting different kinds of organizations that have kind of social good at the core of it. How that pans out, I'm not quite sure, but these are the kinds of discussions that are happening, and a lot of the work that's being done is happening in more and more consortia. What's interesting is the big tech companies are betting on a certain way of building AI, which is building larger and larger neural networks. And a lot of us in the field feel that that's a way that might pan out well, but it's not the only way to go. And so often what you find is those of us sitting in universities have different philosophical approaches to thinking about the problem. When we think that you don't solve, we don't, the route to more capable AI isn't just about more data and more compute, because we're running up against limits in some of these issues, and that there's different methodologies we should be looking at. For example, I've just been in the process of launching an AI institute that's focused on very much biologically inspired solutions to these problems, to say, the kinds of tools we're looking at aren't the right way to go. We've got to take different approaches. Can we develop some of those technologies? There's other things. I've got a startup called Lalapa AI, where we focus on building technologies for African languages, because it turns out you can't throw the same tools at trying to build technologies for African languages, because they're all what we call under-resourced, which means there's not enough data online to be able to train them to perform the same way as something might in English and French. And so you need different solutions to these. And so I think taking a diversity of approaches is the correct solution here. Talking to the question of losing control to AI is a big, hotly debated issue. Many people scoff at this and call it a sci-fi fantasy. I think it's a real threat. And if we go back to what is the root of the field, the root of the field is about trying to build machines that are more capable than humans. If we can do that, we've got to ask the question, what is it that stops something taking control of itself? If we can build something that is able to speak better than humans can, that is able to reason better than humans can, that is able to understand emotions better than humans can, that is able to have ambitions better than humans can, isn't it hubris to think that a human that is worse on all these dimensions would be able to control it? And so, there's philosophical questions about what is possible in the limit. Maybe there's things that aren't reproducible in machines that we have as humans, but many of us do view that as hubris. And so if we take the pursuit of this field possible, then by all means we are going to lose control, particularly if we're not taking it seriously. And I think that's a huge threat to basically humanity.
All right, thanks, Prof. So the second or the next question that we have is from Roland, and he writes, "Please talk a bit about AI and instrumentarianism, or the instrumentalization of behavior for the purposes of modification, prediction, monetization, and control."
So I must be honest, I don't understand the question. I wonder if, Roland, you can, maybe that's me coming from a simple science background, but I don't quite get that. So maybe you can elaborate on that a little bit.
Yes, I think if Roland maybe can raise his hand, I'll definitely unmute him and he can expand more on that question. But just moving on from that, while we have other questions here, we have another one from Janine. And Janine writes, Dear Benjamin, thank you very much for the interesting presentation. In your opinion, what kind of regulation do you think is best to cope with the risks?
That's the big question at the moment. And there's a lot of different movements here. There's a lot of different ideas. I'm not convinced we figured out the right thing, but I don't know what the right thing is. Now, I think it's worth bearing in mind that there's a lot of different risks. And I don't think there's a one size fits all strategy. I think there's different things we've got to do in different cases. So, this could range, for example, to, what there's risks about, you know, that I didn't talk about here, but that we're obviously all aware of, is like protection of personal information, right? And there's acts that cover this, like that, companies are held responsible for the way these are dealt with. There's other kinds of risks. We talk about what could happen if we get large systems that are taking full agency. Well, the ways some of the legislation's moving in that direction is to say, that there's limits on the kinds of models you can train. If the speculation is that the larger the models are, the higher the risks of these kinds of things because they become more capable, then maybe there the kind of challenge is make sure that the models don't get bigger than a certain size. The problem is we don't know what those sizes should be. We don't know exactly what that should entail, and we don't know what kinds of checks should be in place at that point. I think there should be regulations about models not being made public unless they've passed certain checks, but we don't know what those checks should be. We need more engagement with like certain aspects of like the ethics community and the philosophical community on trying to figure out like what are the tests that should be run before we can declare that something is safe. But I think we do need that more that happens in a kind of monitoring type paradigm to say, if you're a company, whether a big tech or a startup or something, and you're building this kind of technology, you should be able to at least pass certain checkboxes before you either open source this technology. And lots of people hide behind open sourcing. It's like, no, I'm putting this into the hands of the public, so I'm free of I'm absolving myself of any responsibility. But I think anything from that to deploying products, you've got to actually, the onus should be on you to prove that it's safe before you do so.
All right, thanks for that, Prof. I don't know if Roland will be able to elaborate on the question. Roland?
Yes, thank you for the opportunity. Yeah, so Prof, my question really is that AI is using predictive language and different software to get people to buy more, to spend more time online, to use a lot of their resources on various online platforms, et cetera, et cetera. Where are the guardrails, and what is really the responsibility of governments and so on to try and limit this type of behavior?
Cool. So I think that's a really important question, and it's I think a much bigger question than AI. This talks to a lot of the way that I think like the attention kind of model of social media has been essentially very destructive to our sanity as individual humans, but also has caused problems like more polarization politically and this kind of thing. And it's really this attention driven economy. Now there's a bit of a trade-off here, because what's interesting is, from like, if you are running one of these models, if you're a big tech company, you're kind of incentivized to actually answer the question as best as possible, right? You kind of actually want, in the shortest amount of time, to solve the problem of the person you're talking to, because if you don't, if you ask lots of clarifying questions, you're going to irritate the person you're working with. At the same time, actually, every time it produces text, it costs them money. So they're actually incentivized to get it to give you the correct answer as quickly as possible. I think the problem is that they're embedded in bigger frameworks of these, like, kind of the way the internet is structured at the moment, is that it's all about demanding more and more of our time. I worry, though, that things could progress. So you could imagine a next stage of these models. These, your chat GPTs very much operate in a mode of like, you say something, they respond. You say something, they respond. But you could very easily have them run in a different mode where they ping you randomly on your phone and ask you a question. How's your day going or something? In which case, they're going to start interfering with your attention as well in that way. And so I think there is more of a risk of it progressing down that path that actually ends up being more destructive. Now, I don't know what the correct solution is here. I think we've been driven by bad incentivization models all along. And actually, this is one of my worries about AI. I think, I like to say, there've been two previous waves where computer scientists, the brave and noble computer scientists, wanted to do good things for society. And I remember, when the web became a thing, the model was all information should be free because that's the right thing to do. And we're just going to make companies pay for stuff with their adverts. That's going to be the correct way to do things. It was very noble intentions. And basically, this ended up with this attention-shattering model that we've got now, was the unintended consequence of kind of not thinking through the effects of what happens if advertising is driving everything. This happened again with social media. We thought, okay, we're going to make this all free and everyone's going to be in these big social networks and everyone's going to be friends and sharing ideas and the world's going to be great. It's all going to be kumbaya. And then we ended up, again, not thinking this through properly and ending up with these very fractured communities that ended up being very polarized. And I worry we're going to do this again and again, not think through the consequences and try and do this in a way that we believe is maximally beneficial for humanity, but do it in a way that's counterproductive. And I think this is a broader question that I must say I don't know what the answer is to. Personally, it looks like not going on Twitter much, but I think there's bigger questions here about kind of our prevailing sanity.
All right, thanks for that, Prof. Because we're going now in the order of the questions, we have another one from Roland. And again, Roland writes here that AI has been used in Ukraine to direct drones. Also, the recent explosion of pages presages how AI can be used in wars. Troll farms can also use AI to prop up dictators. How do multilateral processes control this when lawmakers in the major economies don't even understand AI?
That's also a good question. I mean, they always say this thing about, you build powerful tools and then it depends how people use it. And that's always going to be the case. I think, some of the use of AI in military isn't quite as cut and dried as people make it out to be. On the one hand, like, you don't want like weapons that can control themselves and they can go and do anything. And there's basically lower costs to starting wars. On the other hand, if you use AI in the correct way, and if you've got, I don't know, if you're shooting at a target and you've got the probability of an AI controlling it reduces if an AI controlling it reduces the probability of civilian casualties, and you can provably say that this is the case compared to if a human was doing it, maybe that's a better thing. And I mean, I think that there are nuances to these conversations. Not that I'm a fan of it being used in general in these kinds of ways. I think the bigger question that you come down to is how do we actually control this when people don't understand how AI works? And that's a important question. I mean, I've found recently, in discussions with people that actually work in Brussels, on policy questions, I found that their view of AI looked a lot more like what I showed you, the good old-fashioned AI was at the beginning, that people that have this idea that ChatGPT works by basically doing Google searches or looking in a database rather than it's actually synthesizing its answers to you every time. And if you fundamentally don't understand the technology and how it works, I think that really handicaps your ability to respond to it. I'm a computer scientist. I don't know about how society works. I don't know how law works. I don't know how policies work, but I do know how this technology works, which is why I try and when I give these talks, talk about giving across the correct intuitions of what these models are doing and why there's challenges, right? So I think this is critically important that people like you who are engaging these conversations are equipped to think about them in the right way. Think about the limitations that we can't go and, if you think that AI works by a database of facts, you could go in there and delete all the things about harming humans, right? For example, or you could write in some rules about don't harm humans. But if you understand that it's this connection of billions of numbers that are just like sending signals between themselves over and over again, we actually have very few tools to analyze what they're doing. It's the exact same way as if I gave you a person you've never seen before and said, predict how they're going to respond to a certain situation. It's really hard for us to do that. If you have gotten to know this person over many years, maybe you've also done psychological testing of them and these kinds of things, maybe you can be quite good at making predictions, but in general, we can't. And I think in many ways, it's useful to think of an AI rather than a tool that's sitting on your computer. It's more useful to think of it as an alien technology we don't really understand. It's incredibly powerful, but we don't always know why it's doing what it's doing. And with that kind of framing, it puts us in a better position, because it's not like you can just get the right computer scientist and we can go there and just make sure it never messes up in certain ways, because we don't know how to do that, right? We haven't invested enough in the kind of research that analyzes what's going on, in the kinds of, there's a bit of an arms race around this, which is very much, rather than a scientific research endeavor, it's an engineering endeavor just to build bigger and bigger models with the science lagging behind of understanding how they work and what they do. So there's a big part of this is that information dissemination of these are fundamental limitations of these models, but also looking at cases where, with that framing in mind, how do we respond to these risks?
All right, thanks, Prof. The next question here, in the order of questioning, is from Lanley Simpson. But I just unmuted him, hoping maybe he would be able to ask this directly. Lanley, can you unmute and maybe ask a question?
Okay, I don't know if you can hear me.
Yes, we can hear you.
Yes, we can hear you. Okay, so effectively this relates to new forms of social stratification which are starting to come up. So in effect, I refer to digital feudalism, where in effect you have your platform owners are the kings. These kings then create linkages with the major gentry, which are their partners in their operations. These partners then go to other countries and create linkages with the minor gentry, which is your content providers and your influencers and so forth. And then right at the bottom, you have the serfs, who effectively are the people that have to pay for their right to exist in cyberspace as the monetization process occurs. So this digital feudalism is a new form of social stratification that's occurring within the systems. How, with AI, and I'm not talking about that AI is in control, it's actually humans that are in control and the elites that actually operate with them. How, in fact, does this start, and how do we deal with these new forms of social stratification that are effectively creating new forms of oppression as well, both within the ownership and control of the means of production, and the way the new world of work starts to emerge?
Cool. So this is interesting, and I think cool. Thanks. Yeah. So this is interesting because there's a lot of discussion on this, and I tend to take a slightly longer term view on this. And I don't know if that's right, and I don't know if my view is right, but to me, the way I see it playing out is that what you describe now is true, but I think it's more of a short-term situation, because if you think about the way you've described this now, firstly, you've got the content producers. And in a way, we've given tools to like the entire planet to generate content. But I think you don't need everybody to have that. So all the creativity that went into this before, I think, is becoming less critical, right? And you could imagine a case where you could have content generating farms that are completely run not by humans, that generate content that humans like more than other humans do. So you could almost see that influencer class falling away as being kind of unnecessary, because if you think about what's needed at the moment, there's some prompting and some editing. All of that is stuff that people are trying to automate. And so you could see like that falling away. Then you look at like I'm not going into too much detail there. We can discuss that more. But then you look at the kind of people controlling things, which, as I say, are the tech companies. Now, if we look at like a division of classes here, What does that mean? Well, these companies employ tens of thousands of people doing all the things that they're doing. But over time, as we increase the capabilities of these systems, and we're already seeing this, right? They're getting better at coding. So these companies are laying off more and more coders. So what does that mean is that there's fewer and fewer people in those spheres of these companies, right? Then we raise the capability. So there's, I'm fully expecting we're going to see more kind of middle management type roles being taken by AI over the next few years, which means more of those people are going to be laid off. And this is going to keep pushing because, again, if we take the step back, what is it that humans can do that we don't believe is fundamentally automatable? And if I'm perfectly honest with you, the only thing humans can do that we're not quite sure how to automate is consciousness. And if when we attend consciousness conferences and things, I've yet to see an example of a behavior that we couldn't automate without consciousness. So there's a function that we maybe don't know how to automate yet, but we can't see anything that it's capable of that we can't automate through other means. So what this means is, like, if you take this to its logical conclusion, what does that mean? That means maybe you end up in a state where you slowly lay off everybody in a tech company up until the CEO. And then why isn't your AI better than your CEO? Because along the way, maybe it can now do all the things that a CEO can do. Not only that, but it's able to reason 200,000 times faster than that CEO. Not only that, but it's now also capable of all the middle management stuff and the low-level coding and the content generation, which renders that CEO obsolete. And so we actually take this to its logical conclusion. Who is this human that would be sitting at the top of a pyramid? It would be the AI at the top of the pyramid. Now, I don't know what that world looks like, but what I can say is that on the trajectory we're on, if some humans are losing their job, then, like, if you talk to anyone who's active in the field, there's no reason to think that every human won't lose their job, including the most powerful humans ever, right? And so this is actually quite a different paradigm to what we talked about before. This is something we don't understand and don't know how to deal with. What on earth does it mean to be in a world where, like, a human might be inferior in every possible way? It doesn't make sense to me that we can talk about still controlling AIs if they're fundamentally better than humans in every possible way. I mean, again, this gets into the realm of the sci-fi, but really, if you take the kind of aims and ambitions of the field seriously, that's a trajectory. There's nothing qualitatively different about, like, a solid software engineer whose job is already under threat and a CEO, right? It's just different. We've dialed up the knobs or down the knobs on different kind of attributes, right? All of which talk to our cognitive capabilities, which we've already seen ad nauseum now are automatable. And so I don't view that there's this kind of class of humans that have magical properties that are not automatable, or that we won't eventually see AIs replacing them, whether they want to be replaced or not. And so I think, again, what this means is that your question talks to a short-term view, which I think is inherently kind of not a stable equilibrium. And I see that, I see our problems as being much bigger than that in a way. Like, because if we do this wrong, maybe we do things up until a point and we stop it. Again, I don't know how we would stop it, because probably this would be very difficult. We've got to either think about, we either got to accept that conclusion or do something now to put ourselves in a better trajectory, which might mean that we think about jobs in a different way. We think about some sort of post-work type world. And I think really thinking about a different system is the only thing to me that makes sense, because, like, I don't believe that there will be jobs for everybody. I feel that the number of feasible jobs in the world will only be decreasing from now on. Well, kind of on average. And the limit is 0 jobs. And so either we get there in an unpleasant way, or we get there in a way that's actually designed to maximize human flourishing, etc. So I think really we've got bigger questions here to think about.
All right, thanks for that, Prof. We have one last question on the chat box here from Keith. Well, second last now, from Keith Breckenridge. And Keith asks, how do you characterize the model's ability to explain their decision-making informal reasoning, as one might have to do in a court, for example?
So again, it depends on the kind of AI that we're talking about. If we're looking at kind of the there's particular kinds of models that have been designed where you can trace through their formal reasoning. And these are things that are particularly favored in certain industries where you have to be able to do that. The large language models are like do this to an extent, but again, they're not doing this so much as like actually retrospecting and introspecting over what they're doing. They're doing this again by predicting words one by one. So like they're trying to generate the text that they would expect to be seen if they had said something and you asked them to explain their reason. Which is a bit different because it's kind of a post hoc thing. Maybe it's okay. Maybe that means that they give you a conclusion and then they give you a way to reach that conclusion. Now, again, we've got to kind of ask the question, are we happy to accept that? Does it make sense to us? Because, you know, what that's not doing is well, in a way, that's kind of what we do when we explain our reasoning. It tends to have some degree of post hocness. I can never, which is what we'd like to be able to do, explain to you why I said a certain thing I did, right? I might say, well, that's the thing that came to mind, but we know from a lot of behavioral studies and psychological studies that we're actually not aware of these processes. We don't have control over why certain concepts popped into mind, right? Now, what's cool about AI is we can actually trace back the connections that were kind of highlighted. We can do the almost fMRI analysis of like what parts of their artificial brains lit up to make this decision, but we can't trace back to why that was the case. You know, it's going to be the case because they encountered certain data at certain points in their training that happened in one order as opposed to another order, right? There's this kind of causal loop that we can only really take back so far. And I think, again, at some point, we've got to draw a line and say, what are we prepared to accept? What I think is also interesting is that the way these models are progressing also gives us more insight into our own intelligence and our own reasoning processes. And I think that this is something exciting because, you know, we can ask the same kind of questions. Why did I say something or do something? And, you know, the more I understand about how the brain works, the more I can trace back into what might have caused that. Now, again, at some level, you got to draw the line. Can you trace this back to all the traumas I might have experienced in the past? Like maybe. But this is interesting because the tools we've got to use now to analyze these things overlaps a lot with the kinds of tools we use in neuroscience. So again, when you ask it to explain itself, it's doing it very much in a post hoc way, the way a human would. It's not necessarily telling you it's doing this because someone made it consume a bunch of content from like a troll on Twitter during, you know, 20% into its training process, and that's now influencing what it's doing now. That we don't have a good handle on how to think about. Hope that answers the question.
Thanks, Prof. I think it might. I just think I'll use my powers here as moderator to maybe just ask one last question.
Cool.
In your presentation, you spoke about you know, how AI has been used in health sectors, for instance, to help with diagnoses, and how there's a likelihood that doctors and more specialists might be using that, you know, as time goes, in terms of coming up with solutions for extending the life of their patients. So I just wanted to know, in that context, are we likely maybe to see a dependency on AI, where expertise and such knowledge is necessary, and maybe just not in the health sector, but in other sectors as well overall? And what does this then mean, if that's the case, for the future of education, right? Do we still need to create sort of expertise and knowledge in this if we are to depend on AI?
Well, I mean, that's a big question. So firstly, on the healthcare thing, I think I would be shocked if in the next 2 years or so we didn't see some big like outcomes in the healthcare space. There's been like one of my colleagues likes to point out recently, Demis Hassabis, who's the head of Google DeepMind, has been making some claims about how he'll be surprised if there aren't big breakthroughs, AI-enabled breakthroughs in the next couple of years. And he's not the kind of person who's going to say something unless it's almost in the bag. So I suspect we're going to see things coming out on this front soon. And, you know, really this is about thinking about, we've got a huge amount of data and what can we do to analyze it? And there's a few ways to think about this, you know. So for example, maybe two examples. One thing that I like pointing out is it's possible that a significant percentage of humans are allergic to carrots. But what does a carrot allergy look like? It's like if you eat a carrot, it means you won't sleep well tomorrow night. Okay, no human ever would notice that correlation. It's just too complicated. But if we had enough data being recorded by enough people, we could do personalized healthcare. We could start saying, hang on, based on like having consumed data from like millions of people around the world, and you know, the thing you're wearing on your watch is now watching what you eat or something, it could now say, hang on, I've now detected you're allergic to carrots, or you know, you should stop drinking coffee after exactly 2:37 because then it's going to affect your sleep. Like these kinds of things we know are possible. We just need to have like connect the dots on getting it to work. There's a project that we've got going at Wits at the moment where there's another new institute that's focusing on the connections between viruses and cancer. And this has been found in a couple situations, but there's speculation that possibly a lot of cancers are caused by viruses, but we don't know how to tackle that. And so we're looking at projects there. For example, can we use AI to sift through all the literature that has been generated before to come up with hypotheses of where there might be connections? So it's these kinds of things that just not feasible for a human to look at, where we can really look at really strong patterns in data that again might only exist if you as a human could look at like every case of someone who's ever had a certain kind of cancer before, you might find a pattern. And only AI can do that. Humans can't do that. So that's one thing that I think will be very exciting. In terms of education, you know, there's the pros and the cons, and there's different ways to think about this. I'm excited about the ability to look at, again, more personalized education. And we've been involved in a number of these projects where you could say, you know, can you, based on what someone's doing, can you figure out what their educational goals are and figure out what content you should be giving them to accelerate their progress towards that? You know, if you think about the way you might want to, in the ideal sense as a teacher, right? You might want someone to learn a lesson and then get tested, and then you analyze what they've done to figure out what are they good at, what are they misunderstanding, give them content that's going to help them with their misunderstandings. Now, could we do that without testing? Maybe we do that by looking at how long do they engage with certain content, or when do they get distracted, and that kind of thing. Can we start inferring things about their state of mind? Can we infer things about their state of knowledge? And if you can do this, you can really take personalized education to everybody on the planet. And I think there's a lot of exciting potential with that. But now the flip side is, what should we actually be teaching people? And for the longest time, everyone was saying like, well, you know, maybe we should be teaching everyone to code, for example. But in the last year or so, we've seen that coding looks like a thing that's reasonably easy to automate. And probably we don't need the entire world to be able to code. It's incredibly useful at the moment. Even if you're working in an industry that's using a lot of AI, it's useful if you can code as well. You can use AI very successfully. You'll be far better than someone who's not using AI. And I don't think someone yet can get by only using AI to code. But like, this doesn't strike me as the thing we should be teaching all our kids. And I think this talks to that broader question of how do we want to position ourselves as a species? Like, how should we be thinking about jobs? Are jobs things that we really want to hang on to desperately, or do we want to try and figure out what does a society look like where what you do with your time and how you afford to buy food are not coupled? And I think those are the kinds of questions we've got to ask. Like, should you have to work for a living? Like, does that even make sense in a world where we can do, you know, ultimately all the work we need, and we don't need humans to be involved in this process? Can we decouple those things? In which case, maybe the question is to be thinking about in educational spaces, how do I define myself? How do I define value in my own life that's not related to what I do on a day-to-day basis? Like, that's what's related to what I'm given a paycheck for. Like, how do I find value in life that's not paycheck related? How do I find value in life that's actually got some sort of meaning to me? And I think these are maybe the deeper questions that we need to start thinking about, rather than, you know, saying, Who am I? Well, I'm a person that can get maximum productivity in the finance industry by working on such and such a kind of problem. And I think possibly these are what we should be teaching, but the kinds of skills that goes with that, I don't know. It's going to be interesting to see how the next few years pan out.
All right, thanks so much for that, Prof. With that, I would like to close the Q&A session, looking at the time. And yeah, I just wanted maybe to respond to Anselm Adume's comment. Yes, we will definitely share the recording once it's ready. But yeah, I would really, really like to thank our colleagues here at the Rosa-Luxemburg-Stiftung Southern Africa office for their support as well as engagement in this dialogue. I would like to thank as well our audience for staying with us for what looked to be a actual 2-hour dialogue. And I'd definitely like to send a special thanks to you, Prof. Rosman, for the very, very rich and insightful presentation, along with your analysis to some of the questions that were posed here. And just before I let everyone go, I wanted to let you know that if you are interested in some of our events under this dialogue series, the Polycrisis of Carbon Democracy, we do have an upcoming event that will take place on the 10th of October, and it will feature a focus on the rise of the far-right politics in Europe and challenges for the world. But yeah, I'd really like to thank everyone for joining. See you next time. Thank you.
Thanks so much, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.